Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us once again on a Connecting Conversations with me, Carla from Cohesia Connect. And I'm so delighted to invite Dr. Tony Malone to today's conversation, who is, if I may say the title, a charity director, writer, and human environmentalist rights advocate. And he's working to reduce inequality across the world. Now, I have never come across a very detailed title like that, but it sounds so full of wonderful things. Dr. Tony, it's so good to have you. Tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do.
Hi, Carla. Well, thank you for inviting me to come along and talk to you. I very much use the phrase reducing inequalities for about 25 years now. I started off in the corporate world when it was called corporate social responsibility, which I absolutely loathed as a title, which is essentially what we do when we talk about equity, belonging, diversity and inclusion. But it was that early sort of 2000s attempt at getting it. I got really excited about bringing people together. I was really fortunate. My neighbours at the time were some of the leading LGBT and women's rights activists across the world. I was lucky enough to live 2 doors down from Sue Saunders, who founded LGBT History Month. Wow. Around the corner lived Caroline Jones, who ran a domestic violence helpline. And over the road was Gabby and Liz Charing, who were part of the women's equality movement from the 1950s onwards.
What is this neighbourhood? I have to ask. I mean, wow.
It was, I moved in with my grandmother in Brockley in South London at the time. And I moved in and made friends with these inspiring human rights activists. And I'd like to actually sort of say that anything I've done since is what they've told me to do. It's what I've learned from them. It's what I've learned in that study of inequality. And it was just really kind of fortuitous circumstance that led me down that path.
Incredible. I think so many questions are to ask, but isn't it amazing? You've mentioned that you've been kind of on this journey for 25 years and how influential it is about the people that leave such impressions in your life. And we should never really take that for granted, because here you are trailblazing something that was just a seed sown in a couple of, friendly acquaintance and friendships built such a long time ago, but the impact you're still seeing now. How would you say that's kind of steered? You mentioned that you're still doing what they've told you to do. How has that kind of evolved in terms of your journey along DEI? How has that impacted this process for you?
It's very much made me human driven. Let's not look at characteristics. Let's not look at communities. Let's look at the individual as that wonderful intersectional miracle that person is. Wow. And then think, how does that person fit within this policy, within this framework, within this marketing and communication strategy, whatever the need is. Yeah. And I think one of the key things that I found fascinating was bringing that when they were updating the Equality Act. I was very fortunate to be one of the people drafted in to say, what would this look like? And how would you write it? I would say I'm not taking responsibility for it. I think it's got lots of gaps. And certainly in the first draft, those gaps weren't there. It's until the politicians get it. But I think it's really important to have that space for allyship, advocacy, and seeing the human. And that's where we start all of the D&I conversations. It's still what I very much do.
I love that you mentioned that, because you're talking about there's an alignment between human rights, therefore equality and DEI. Why is it so important to acknowledge that they really cannot be divorced from each other? They need to be seen kind of as a working collective.
For me, it's about fundamental truths. And the truth is the world doesn't work. Our society isn't going to work. It's built on inequality. Unless there's a big reboot of society, we're going to have to patch the gaps and fix it as we go on. And I don't think by any means human rights are finished. I think they should always be evolving. But human rights, if you start with that first line, and I'm going to use the adapted version because the original Human Rights Declaration didn't include women. So I'll use the adapted version, which is all humans are born free and equal in dignity, rights. And for me, it's that dignity bit. If we all accept that you have dignity and I have dignity, and as well as looking after your dignity, I need to look after my dignity, wouldn't that be a wonderful basis to start all conversations, to start all frameworks about how we build relationships. And I think that real beginning of what is diversity, what is inclusion, how do we achieve equity, begins with that conversation in human rights based in dignity.
And I mean, that is really the dream, like you're saying. And I love how you've beautifully described it. If we can just focus on the humans in front of us rather than get caught up with this characteristic community or this group. Is it possible? I, like you, feel very kind of drawn towards that concept. And I think certainly at Cohesia Connect, this is what fuels what we do in the space we're trying to bring to the market. But is it possible? Because I imagine humans are complex beings. How do we get us to effectively find a way to be cohesive with each other and adopt that? Because I see so many challenges. And like you said, you've already been through a process of adaptation of what equality should look like and who it should include. Is it possible? How do we get there? Do you have thoughts on that?
I think it's less about learning how we get there and more about learning how we shut up. And particularly men, I'm going to put that one straight out there. There's a point in all these conversations, regardless of who you are and what your characteristics are, eventually you stop becoming an ally and you start talking for other people. Okay. And learning that fine line of advocacy, allyship, and overstepping the mark isn't easy. We will all make mistakes. I put my hand up. I make that mistake very frequently, and I apologize for any time I've done it. And it's one of those things that actually, as we learn that barrier, we move the conversation forward. We move to, actually, I can really stand up and talk that we need to end racism. We need to do this. We need to make things different. We need to create equity for Black people. But actually, I'm not the person that should be saying that. I'm the person that should be an ally in that conversation. Right. But when it comes to shaping that into a policy, into what would actually the community like, that's where at most I would facilitate the conversation and get out the way. And I think that's really important to sort of understand that actually you can facilitate, but by facilitating, you need to take that step back and let the conversation take place.
I think what you're talking about is a delicate balance, a necessary delicate balance. And I agree with that so much. And I think when we encounter clients or we encounter other people also on this journey, that they desire for change, they desire the equity that you're speaking of. But I think we feel very torn about at which point do I, as you say, how do I start determining when it's okay to speak? When is it that I take a back seat? How do I, make visible my support in these environments? That's quite a tough balance to kind of get. And I imagine with every circumstance and every context that someone's in, particularly within the workplace, that will look different. Is there a kind of a baseline we can think about trying to at least adopt those basic principles? Because like you're saying, we're going to have to determine that once we're in the circumstance. What are your thoughts on that?
This is where you bring it back to human rights. Let's bring it back to dignity. Let's bring it back to everybody has a right to have a say in their future. Yeah. Everybody has a right to an education, and everyone has a right to decision making. Within that, actually, if you bring this back to that human rights conversation, it doesn't matter if you're planning a project in London or in Dubai or Qatar. Actually, they're all signed up to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So therefore, you have a real common line that runs. Yeah. We always talk about the golden thread when people talk about EDI is the golden thread that runs through everything. Actually, human rights is already there. And if we use human rights as part of that conversation, we bring it into a safer space. And we actually say, we need to bring people together. We need to have these conversations. It will take time. But if we're ensuring dignity in those conversations, if we're ensuring that we're looking around the table and who's not around the table, that's where we can look at the characteristics and communities. Then we need to ensure that we're treating them with dignity, even though they're not in the room. That dignity might be saying, I'm uncomfortable talking about this in this meeting. Let's do some research and come back. Let's invite more people. Let's reach out to a charity, a community group, an advocacy group, and come and join us, because that's what they're there for. They want to be listened to. They want to be heard. And that's how we can actually find that balance, I think.
Yeah, That's so important. I agree with that so much. Now we're going to talk about a little bit about inequality. We've spoken about that, and particularly you've mentioned that there's just so much inequality. This world is based on kind of the building blocks of that. And if we're to look at organizational inequality, how does this kind of relate to the global world, and how do we find a way through that?
It's a tough one, and I think it's almost in three pillars. You have the governments who have their own battles on equality, their own things they want to get through. You have the charitable sector, which is really well intentioned, but can actually is in that really dangerous ground of becoming saviors, becoming the wrong image, and various other elements there. And then you've got the corporate sector. And somewhere across all of this is just, you and I and all of the people in it. And I think it's really important that we connect those three dots. We actually have international corporations sharing best practice with governments. We have governments supporting charities to do things the right way and helping develop the resources. And I think when we look at globally, cultural context is key. Sometimes, particularly if we're talking about LGBT rights, we do need to be mindful of other people's beliefs. We do need to be mindful of other people's cultural backgrounds. But we also have to have that line of, this is a human right. This is where we're going in the future.
I really like what you're saying there. And I think if I was to take a step back objectively and just kind of, have a look at how I think the media certainly presents this conversation, and you speak about, and I really like that you still advocate that we do need to have a consideration that there are other people, or should I say other groups, that have got different values and different kind of ways of belief. And some of those fall in line that are probably quite contrary to, for example, LGBTQ plus context, circumstance, and all the nuances that come with that. And I think there seems to be quite a tension right now. How do we balance that? Because from my understanding, there's many that might not subscribe to an understanding at this point in time, but would love to understand from the human element, even they might share very different or contrasting values towards, the elements around the community. How do we navigate that? Because I think that's a tough one, because I think what I see very much so, and you might see this as well, it appears to be very, very polarizing. It's either one or the other, and anything that kind of does not fit into those boxes is then marginalized or outcast. And this could be coming from places where those that genuinely want to support humans but might still have different values, if that makes sense. How do we navigate that? That's quite a tricky thing, I think, at this point.
I completely agree. And I'm not sure how political I'm allowed to get on this podcast, but here goes. I think when we see that polarizing view, it's perpetuation of systemic inequality. Okay. It's the same driving factors that lead to systemic racism. So it's societal hatred of disabled people, of cultural insensitivities around trans people. Now, that's not the human condition. That's how we're being told. It's either this or this.
Yes.
What nobody's talking about is the fact that who's giving us those choices in the first place? It's not about finding a middle ground. I want to know, why are we being told it's either pro-trans or anti-trans? It's either pro-men or pro-women. Why is everything being given to us in binary conversations? And it's because our society and the politicians who run our society use that as a way of actually perpetuating, maybe subconscious, I'd like to think it is, but perpetuating global inequality, because it keeps people from talking to one another. When I first started in sort of, I'm going to use the term activist in very lowercase.
Inflammatory words right there. I love it.
When I first started this, there used to be this organised by the Ken Livingstone, the then Mayor of London, who I'm not a fan of, but he did do this right, which was put together the Pan London Equality Forum. And I would go along as an LGBT activist and meet Black rights activists, I'd meet disability rights activists, and we'd all share our concerns, would all share and you know what? We all had the same problem, the same person, the same press agency, the same issues. And it allowed us to combine and show solidarity to move things forward. Those structures have been gradually eroding over the last 20 years rapidly. Sometimes corporations are swept in and given them space. A huge fan of the Institute of Government and Public Policy for the way they bring people together to share those conversations. And internationally, the Office of the Commissioner for Human Rights for the United Nations is doing similar. We need to bring these people together. But when we're facing this in our sort of day-to-day lives, it's coming back, it's dignity. Where's the human story in this?
Yeah.
It's great. We're talking about us and them. Why aren't we talking about collective we? And I think that's what a good EDI specialist or good EDI consultant should be able to do, is actually look right beyond what's in front of you and look at what's the aim, where do we eventually want society to go, and how can I help my client be a part of that journey?
Yeah, that's so important. I think what you're talking about just resonates so much with our values, and certainly with me personally. And I think even my story is like, how do we get people talking together? There's so, like, it demytholizes, it brings down those barriers, it brings down those walls if we can focus on the human the human elements that we share, rather than what divides us and what separates us in our difference. And I know that that's even something that, even to say that, I know might raise some eyebrows, because people think, well, please don't look at me just as a human, please see my nuances and all of the intersectional elements that I represent too. And that's not to undermine that, but I think it's so important, in order to cross those bridges like you're describing, is to find a way that we can find mutual ground. And the human element is so key to that process. I'd love to hear more about, in terms of how you, in your personal kind of journey with this, has there been any examples or kind of particular moments that I think have really pressed upon your memory that you think are steered you? It's very clear to hear your passion in all of this that continues to keep you on this journey, because I can't imagine the levels of frustration with someone who is, I think, as open-hearted as you are about, let's bring together everybody because there's hope in that. That can't be easy to do. What has kept you going, if that makes sense, to continue championing this?
That's a really good question. Stubbornness, I think.
In this case, it's well used.
I think there's an element of stubbornness, but there's also an element of seeing the mechanisms of how people come together. There was a conference I was at not too long ago, and it's one of these sort of jokes. I was sitting there representing Buddhism on an interfaith panel, and next to me was an imam, a rabbi, and a priest. And we all walked in. We didn't walk into a bar. We all walked into a meeting room.
Yeah.
And we had that conversation on LGBT rights. We had a conversation on how we make things more inclusive across all our faiths, and what we could do to take back to our relevant authorities to say, we're having this conversation. Where do we move this collectively? Very businesslike, very everything else. The second the business bit stopped and the agenda was off, we're all laughing, joking, and smiling, and getting on like we've always been friends and always will be. And it even led to a very, very good friend of mine that we have met for the first time that day, who's now on phone regularly, a wonderful Reverend Keith, who was going to see the Archbishop of Canterbury. And I was going to the same building to see my friends who were protesting the Archbishop of Canterbury outside. And there was this
what a meeting.
There was this conversation of, we're both going to the same place, we're walking together, we're laughing, we're smiling, we're getting on as friends. People need to see that. People need to see we can have professional disagreement. That's what our history is written on, this professional disagreement. Yeah. But actually, if people see the friendships underlying that, because they're trying to get the best for their faith, they're trying to get the best for the believers in Christianity or whichever the faith is there.
Yeah.
I'm trying to get LGBT rights. I'm trying to achieve equality. We can still have that shared laughter. We can still be human with one another and friends. And then everything else that follows is easier, because you're not meeting somebody confrontationally. You're meeting a friend and saying, oh, look, let's sort this out. Let's have a cup of tea. let's have that conversation. And it becomes easier. It becomes less full of barriers. And then the more you can bring that into your personal life too, and bring it into your work life, that's where inequality really starts dropping.
I think that's so important to hear. And I imagine anyone that comes across this conversation will probably feel quite relieved, because I think there's so many boxes that I think if we're belonging to particular communities, we feel like I need to make sure that I'm in the neat line of the boxes. But this almost incapacitates us in a way that we can have, like you said, the bridge of friendship sometimes, because we feel if we're not kind of in the one box, does it mean that we are compromising values? Are we kind of letting go that, letting down the side? But it really doesn't need to be that way. And just try to find that balance, I think, is the journey, which fully, I think, explains my first question as to what drives you, because clearly this is an evolving process. There really is no one kind of way towards it. How would you encourage others to maybe just make a start towards that journey? Because it is daunting landscape to navigate.
It is. The first thing, and I very much call on sort of my Buddhist teachings actually for this, is learn how to say sorry the right way.
Wow. Can we actually have a moment for forgiveness, plees?
Yeah.
Underrated.
Absolutely. And you're going to make mistakes. I was brought in, I want to say it was 2006 or 7, I was doing some work with a police force with the traveller community. And I was brought in as a community consultant to help build those bridges and to make those friendships. And I completely and utterly failed. And I failed for not knowing enough, for not making those friendships in the right place. I didn't realize, and if anyone feels like Googling this, Travelers Times website has got this fantastic resource video called I think it's The Roads We Come From. But in the traveller community, there's 9 communities, 9 ethnicities, 9 ideas of culture and faith. And if you label them all as one, they all get offended, quite rightly. So when you start to break that down and you start learning about how to move things forwards, and you realize actually they're not so different, actually you can go up and you can make friends and you don't have to be scared, actually the project moves on. And I had to very openly say, I'm sorry, I got this completely wrong. I thought this would be an easy job. It's not. There are other times where you come to inevitable conflict. People who have such strong views that finding that middle ground is a challenge, let alone finding the ability to make a friendship.
Yeah.
And that's where common sense kicks in. I'm a huge advocate for common sense and keeping things simple. But it's also where you have the opportunity to make the most change, to make the biggest difference in the world. And that's where it's tiring. It's a struggle. You will hit every microaggression under the sun thrown at you, but push through. And if you can get just a hint of a smile, if you get them to just sort of acknowledge that you're human in any tiny little way, you've done it. You've made that difference. And the rest of it is easy.
It's just that first hurdle, isn't it? And I love that. Yeah. Can it really be so simple? It is. But I think it's literally, it's a choice to be made. It's a contentedness that I think, like you said, you need to be okay with the fact that we're not going to get it right all the time.
Yes.
But it's so necessary to make a start. And that can feel, I imagine, frightening in terms of, if I make this move in this direction, what's the response that's going to come back to me? What's the fallout as a result of even making a mistake? And I imagine those are difficult things. And I think that feels like overthinking it too much, and then no one does anything, which is, I think, the kind of the caution about why that is. But I think what I'm hearing from you is such an encouragement that it's worth it, because I think more people would receive a sign or a gesture towards extension of friendship or honesty in my human kind of trait and connection there than not. It really goes such a long way. I want to talk about a little bit about your time. Now, I understand that you studied in India for some time. Is that correct? And you were, like you mentioned, Buddhism is a big part of kind of like your academic background, but also something personal in terms of faith. What was that experience like, combining those things? Did you mention that perhaps you were also living as a monk during your time there? Tell us a little bit about that experience, and how did that kind of frame kind of this part of the journey of D&I that you've been on?
So I never set out to be a D&I expert. I never set out to study human rights. And by the age of 18, if you ask me what the first human right is, I'd think, well, I'll just go Google it. Oh, it wasn't Google, then it was Yahoo. So that's how old I am.
Oh my goodness me. I love those times. Yahoo.
Things were so much simpler. But actually, when I was 18, I went traveling. I had a fascination for tea. I wanted to go to Darjeeling and see how tea was grown.
Wow.
And there's a wonderful, if you fly into Siliguri Airport, and there's a wonderful, the Himalayan Mountain Railway. And it is as romantic as it sounds. It's a bright blue steam train, winds its way up the hills. It's got this nice rocking motion, and I fell asleep, and I missed my stop.
Oh, wow.
I got past Darjeeling. I got to Goom Station, and there wasn't another train back for another day, and I needed somewhere to stay overnight. And I saw a monk talking to an American tourist, and I thought, he's local and he speaks English. I will ask him if there's a hotel nearby. So I sort of asked if there's anywhere I can stay. Is a youth hostel, a B&B, a hotel? And this monk looked at me and said, "Oh, yeah, why are you here?" You're thinking, what's this teenager doing? Why is he here with this backpack? And I said, "Well, I've come to learn about tea." Now, to me, I haven't got a mug to hand. I usually have one there. To me, that's sort of the drink and everything else. But I just asked this of the Dalai Lama's personal tea master, the person who, for him, that I've come to learn about tea is a very deep and spiritual conversation.
Wow.
And he invited me to come and stay at the monastery. I went there. I thought, if I'm staying there, I will live by their culture and their timing, so I can actually, this is a huge learning opportunity.
Absolutely, yeah.
2 weeks later, I was sorting my visa out to come back. Not only had I learned about Buddhism and made friends with the fellow nuns and monks that were studying Buddhism, but because I hadn't gone through the tourist route, I'd gone through a different route. I'd met the tea pickers. I'd had dinner with the lady picks the tea for Fortnum and Masons. And what opportunities that was, but also seeing the inequality in that, seeing how that was there. So as well as studying Buddhism, I also set up the Ethical Darjeeling Partnership, which used Western tea sales. So we sold direct from the tea picker to the big department stores and to supermarkets via various brands. And the money started to buy land. And we bought, bit by bit, various bits of tea plantation. And when it became a very large enterprise exporting around 90,000 tons of tea annually, that was the point where I stepped back and handed everything over to the tea pickers. We set up schools, we'd set up hospitals, we'd set up various things, all working through that Buddhist construct of how do we have service to others? How do we have that ability to change locally conditions to create a better world? And then I got sort of still in touch, although I was living back in London at the time and then moved to Wales eventually. But I still in touch with lots of nuns and monks in India, at Tibet, in America now. And I teach tea ceremonies. I'm actually, for the next couple of nights, I'm going across to various locations in Wales to teach teenagers how to meditate with tea. So I still have a sort of hand in doing this, but very much in a low-key way now.
I love that. It sounds to me that you saw inequality in a place that I imagine was so epically beautiful, and you met so many beautiful people, and you still saw it there, and you found a model that was able to address those issues. Do you think that model is transportable, or does it require just at a new lens, a new set of objectives to try and address those same issues in, should I say, here in the Western world?
I think this is very much what I call the Buddhist problem. So people struggle with Buddhism because the first line of any book you pick up on Buddhism is life is suffering. Actually, that's true. It's just very depressing. Life is suffering. You're here for a short time. You're going to die. That pretty much sums up the human experience at the moment. But that's because we choose that, not as individuals, but collectively, we choose that path of suffering. We choose to perpetuate systemic racism. We choose to perpetuate Islamophobia or hatred against disabled people. We choose this as a society to continue it. I think what Buddhism teaches us is it's all in here. There's no one thing in the universe which is inherently unfair, unkind, or uncompassionate. Actually, quite the opposite. The world, the universe, and the world is quite beautiful. It's us and our conscious choices that perpetuate stupidity, for want of a better word. And I think it's one of the things I think Buddhism needs to do more is share that. Forget the mindfulness, forget the meditation, which is what you see in the Hollywood version of Buddhism. It's the perpetuation of attachment to stupidity. I think that's the best way I can put it into English. If Buddhism can teach us one thing, it's how to not be attached to what we've done in the past, not be attached to ignorance, not be attached to unconscious bias, and to not be attached to perpetuation of what's got us to this situation that the world is in now.
The way that you describe that, and obviously for yourself, like you've described the roots is very, very much within kind of Buddhist values and beliefs and philosophies. But I think that's definitely something in terms of if we were to look at just humans and their nature, regardless of, religious belief or faith group that you subscribe to, is that this inherent selfishness of let's say inherent selfishness, but we're not quite, I think, necessarily addressing the fact that we make so many conscious choices as to what our life is looking like. And again, that same power to make the choice for negative is the same power that's going to fuel the change in the opposite direction for better and for change. And I think this is something I think is quite difficult. It's a big, let's have a good look at the mirror and address the person looking back at me there. And it's I think my husband describes it, it's a very strong sense of personal accountability. And personal responsibility and how this, and they're such small, simple things, aren't they? They contribute to the big picture, but it will require, I cannot just put this out there and blame something else, which somehow I've probably impacted or I've created this kind of environment that I'm living in anyway, because of my choice making. And that's a huge thing in terms of walking towards a different direction. I think, could you imagine if everybody was to take on board that principle, what life would look like probably in a week?
I think we started to see that with the pandemic. I hate bringing it up because, for like most people, actually, I had an awful pandemic. I didn't enjoy the experience.
People do.
As far as I'm concerned, pandemics are overrated. We've done that. Let's not do that again. But actually, if you look at the personal responsibility people took, yes, there was selfishness was part of that. But actually, the overriding thing was people behaved. People changed their behavior to look after themselves and others.
And the planet, if I may say. The extent of people going about, doing our normal kind of way of living, which effectively is harmful for the environment. We saw the world healed itself slightly as well, which was incredible.
And I think it's exactly what I was going to get onto, actually. It's that element of when we start taking personal responsibility, the planet responds, because it's actually recognizing that, the humans have just grown up a bit. We'll just give them that back. And I think there's that element of human rights and climate emergency rights are going to be one and the same within the next 50 years.
Yeah.
If you're currently a practitioner in diversity and inclusion, you're going to be a practitioner in diversity, inclusion, and climate change within the next 50 years, because the intersectionality of that is vast. When you look at things, initiatives, I'm a huge fan of the United Nations global goals, the UN, what they call the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, which is a global plan to save the world by 2030. Well, we're never going to do it, but actually everybody committed to it. Every member state of the United Nations, through their national governments, their regional governments, and their local governments, and their schools and education departments and learning mechanisms, the scouts, the guides, the cadet forces, everywhere on the planet said, we will do something towards this. No faith has ever united the human race in the same way. No political party has ever united people in the same motivation. And no other big media event has said, let's all do this in the same way. That really quiet, let's just make the world slightly better. let's break this down into the 17 goals that are actually all quite achievable, and let's do it. And we're seeing that with the reduction of, as I think the SDG number 1 is zero poverty. We're not quite at zero poverty yet, but do you know it's dropped? That what we consider poverty has slid up by $1. That's fantastic on a global scale. I'm really looking forward to seeing how far that slides in the next 6-7 years.
Yeah.
If you look at gender equality, that's kind of staying the same, but the conversations are taking place.
Yeah.
And that might mean that actually, if we're all going to commit to a global change, 2030 isn't realistic, maybe 2050 or, and the century beyond that. But actually, we can monitor the changes and the differences just a conversation takes.
Yeah.
And I think bringing all of these back to those climate conditions, the conversations around human rights, this all comes back to how we treat each other with dignity. Because if we're doing that, we're treating the planet with dignity too.
Yeah. I think that is
preachy then.
No, that was exactly what I wanted to hear, and I think you're absolutely right. And I think this goes back to, there is nothing about any of these elements that we're talking about that is isolated or binary from one another. This intersectionality and acknowledgement of that, and trying to make sure that actually we find a way to use them all in a cohesive way to move towards an equitable kind of change in society is so necessary. And we have to get comfortable with that. We have to become aware of that. We have to become educated on that and see how these things kind of interplay and impact one another. It's been amazing talking to you. But before I go, I just want to spend some time. Tell us a little bit about your book, Dr. Tony. I'd love to hear some more about the book. And I imagine a lot of what you've shared today really funnels into kind of what this book really shares. Tell us a little bit about it and what you're hoping that it's going to do in terms of its message.
Yeah, so I've actually wrote a few books on equality. The one that I'm most proud of is the least seller, which is this one, which is very much about human rights, looking at what they mean to you and me and collectively. And I call this my guide to activists. So if you're ever out and you're at a protest, and it's a peaceful protest, which is the only kind that should exist, you're out there with your placards, respectfully protesting, and the police tell you you can't do that, or press demonize you. It's all in here, what you need to say. On this page, what you need to say. That brings it into human rights law. Actually, you have a right to peaceful assembly. You have a right to protest. The conversations which are taking place around human rights in the UK now are quite frankly terrifying. And my biggest concern for the world at the moment is if Europe loses its grasp of human rights, we will descend into darkness again. And I think it's really important we keep those conversations going. But the book everybody asked me about is this one. It's now, I'm quite pleased to say, it's sold just under 1 million copies across the world.
Congratulations.
It's in its second edition. I'm working on a third edition. However, I decided the third edition is the last edition, and then we're moving on because we need to move on, and it's other authors need to come into this space. And half of it is a glossary of terms. It's I'm just going to pull up. I've got the page L there that starts off with Latino, Latinx, and lesbian. And you can look up what these terms mean. If you're not sure what go to M. If you're not sure what mansplaining is, if somebody uses a word you don't know, there's a really friendly definition.
Okay.
The other half of the book is some ideas and some cultural understanding. There's a whole commentary on the SDGs, but there's also a review of the world's top 20 faiths with not what the key dates are, not what the holidays are, but what the cultural meaning is. How do you make friends with people from different faiths? And there's some highlight stuff within there as well around press examples and how to move things forwards. I call it the practical guide because I deliberately omit case studies. I don't think we should always talk about what you've done in the past or what you can do with this information. I think we should focus on, let's build that connection. Let's have that conversation and let other people do that work, because it's their voice we need to hear.
I love that so much. Let's build that connection. And I'm going to
Waterstones and Amazon, I should say. Sorry.
Brilliant. No, that's so good. I'm sure we'll have all of those details at the bottom of this podcast as well, so
Great.
people can follow and find your work, which I know has just been so inspiring to so many already by the sound of the sales. But I think hearing the man behind the wisdom of that has just been so enriching and so encouraging. Dr. Tony, I want to thank you so much for sharing your time, your thoughts, and your journey with us here at Cohesia Connect. This, I think, to date is probably one of my favorite conversations so far. I don't know if I'm allowed to say that, but it's just been so insightful and so encouraging to hear another person championing connection, championing let's find the place that draws people together rather than separates us through our differences. And on that note, I just want to say thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Tony, and wishing you all of the best in your future endeavours.
Thank you, and thank you for creating spaces like this where we can all come together. Thank you.
Thank you. Take care, and we'll speak to you again soon.
See you.